"Draw me, and I'll change your life," the millionaire sneered. But when the orphan turned the sketchpad around, the room fell silent. Why did the portrait look like a funeral? What truth had he just exposed? And why did it make the millionaire tremble? What happens when a millionaire's cruel mockery becomes a mirror that reflects his deepest secret? When 13-year-old Tiffany Ehlert, an orphaned street artist with nothing but a salvaged pencil set and the gift his late teacher gave him, accepts a challenge meant to destroy him, nobody expects what comes next. This is the story of how one portrait, drawn in minutes before Chicago's elite, can expose not just a face, but a soul, and change two lives forever. Dear viewer, I humbly request you to watch or listen till the end and rate this story out of 10. Your rating will help me give you better stories in next videos. If you're watching my story for the first time, subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. The autumn wind swept through downtown Chicago, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust, but Tiffany Ehlert barely noticed any more. His 13-year-old hands, stained with charcoal and graphite, moved across his worn sketchpad with a confidence that contradicted his threadbare jacket and scuffed shoes. The marble steps outside the Harvey Art Museum had become his gallery, a patch of concrete where he'd spent the last 3 hours sketching portraits of passers-by for spare change. "Could you tilt your chin just a bit?" he asked softly, completing a sketch of a tourist couple. They smiled at the result, dropping $10 into the coffee can beside him before hurrying toward Michigan Avenue. Tiffany had made $37 today, enough for dinner at the shelter and maybe a new eraser if he was careful. His fingers were getting cold, but he kept working. Art was the only thing that made sense anymore, the only connection to Claire, the teacher who'd believed in him before cancer took her 2 years ago. She'd taught him that every face tells a story. You just have to look closely enough to see it. The glass doors of the Harvey Art Museum burst open, and Jack Harvey himself emerged, flanked by reporters, photographers, and museum staff. At 52, Harvey commanded attention. Silver-streaked hair, perfectly styled, burgundy suit that screamed wealth and taste, and the confident stride of a man who owned everything he touched. He was Chicago's art kingpin, the billionaire who decided which artists mattered and which ones faded into obscurity. "Mr. Harvey, one more question about the Visions of Greatness exhibit," a reporter called out. But Jack's attention had snagged on something else, the sketch of a museum sculpture that Tiffany had been working on during a slow moment. Tiffany didn't notice the entourage at first, absorbed in adding shadows to his drawing. His eyes were focused, his breathing steady, the way Claire had taught him. Don't just draw what you see. Draw what you feel. "Well, well," Jack's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What do we have here? Street art at the doorstep of actual art." Tiffany's hand froze mid-stroke. He looked up into the cold, appraising eyes of Jack Harvey. He'd seen this man's face in newspapers, on charity galas. Always surrounded by masterpieces, the man who'd donated millions to preserve great art, but who had no time for artists who weren't already famous. "I'm just drawing, sir," Tiffany said quietly, closing his sketchpad. Jack laughed, a sound without warmth that drew the attention of the journalists. Several cameras swung toward them, sensing a story. "Drawing? That's generous. I call it amateur scribbling." He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking on marble. "Let me see that." The small crowd grew larger. Security guards hovered nervously. Jack's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine, whispered urgently, "Mr. Harvey, the press conference." But Jack wasn't listening. He'd plucked the sketch pad from Tiffany's hands and was studying the sculpture drawing with the critical eye of a collector. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even recognition of talent. Then his expression hardened again. "Not bad," he said loudly, making sure the cameras caught it. "For a stray. Tell me, boy, how much do you make doing this? $20 a day? Maybe $50 if tourists feel generous?" Tiffany's jaw tightened. "Enough to get by." Enough to get by. Jack pulled out his wallet, extracting several crisp bills. He held them up, playing to his audience. "You want real money? You want to amount to something instead of freezing on these steps?" Tiffany's eyes flicked to the money. $200, maybe more. That was food for 2 weeks. New pencils. Maybe even a winter coat that actually fit. "Here's my offer," Jack announced, his voice ringing with theatrical generosity. "There's a gala at my museum this Saturday. 500 of Chicago's finest, collectors, critics, philanthropists, all gathered for the unveiling of my new collection. You show up at 8 p.m. sharp, and you draw me. Right there, in front of everyone." The crowd gasped. Catherine's face went pale. "Mr. Harvey, if your portrait is good enough to hang in my gallery," Jack continued, his smile razor-sharp, "I'll adopt you, give you a real home, education, training with master artists. Everything a boy like you could dream of." He paused, letting hope flicker in Tiffany's eyes before delivering the killing blow. "But when you fail, and you will fail, because what could a street orphan possibly understand about capturing greatness? You never show your face near my museum again. Ever. You take your little drawings and your coffee can somewhere else. Deal?" The crowd held its breath. Cameras zoomed in on Tiffany's face. Some in the audience looked sympathetic, others curious, a few disgusted by the public spectacle. Jack stood there, money still extended, waiting for the humiliation he'd orchestrated to reach its crescendo. Tiffany looked at the money, then at Jack Harvey's face, that expression of barely concealed contempt mixed with the absolute certainty of victory. He thought of Claire, who'd once told him, "The best portraits don't flatter. They reveal." "Keep your money," Tiffany said quietly, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I'll take your challenge." Jack's eyebrows rose in surprise. Then he laughed again, tossing the bills into Tiffany's coffee can anyway. "Saturday, 8 p.m. Don't be late, though I suspect you'll find an excuse not to show." He turned to walk away, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Oh, and kid, dress appropriately. We have standards." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring. Some gave Tiffany sympathetic looks. Others shook their heads, already counting him out. Catherine lingered for a moment, her expression unreadable, before hurrying after her boss. Tiffany sat alone on the marble steps as evening shadows lengthened across the museum facade. He looked down at the money in his can, more than he'd made in a week, and then at his hands, stained with graphite and potential. He didn't know it yet, but in 5 days, in front of Chicago's elite, he would create a portrait that would reveal not just Jack Harvey's face, but the guilt, loneliness, and grief the millionaire had buried beneath years of arrogance. A portrait that would expose the secret connection between them, one that began with a woman named Claire Harvey, who'd once believed that art could heal even the most broken souls. Tiffany Ehlert wasn't always the boy on the museum steps. 6 years earlier, before the streets taught him how to disappear into crowds, before his hands learned to turn hunger into art, He was just another name on a file folder at Riverside Orphanage, a squat brick building on Chicago's South Side, where forgotten children waited to be remembered. He'd been left there as an infant, wrapped in a yellow blanket with no note, no name, no explanation. The nurses named him Tiffany because it was Tuesday, and Ehlert because that was the surname of the police officer who'd found him in the hospital parking lot. His entire history fit into 3 lines of paperwork. Male infant, approximately 3 days old. No identifying information. Most kids at Riverside spent their childhoods hoping for adoption. Tiffany stopped hoping by age 7. Instead, he learned to find family in other ways, in the old janitor who taught him to fix things, in the cook who saved him extra portions, and most importantly, in Claire Harvey, the art teacher who volunteered every Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Harvey was different from the other volunteers. She didn't bring pity or forced cheerfulness. She brought pencils, paper, and an intensity that made every child feel seen. Where others saw orphans, she saw artists. Where others saw broken kids, she saw unfinished masterpieces. Art isn't about making pretty pictures, she'd told Tiffany during his first lesson when he was 9 years old. She'd caught him sketching the building's security guard, capturing the weariness in the man's eyes. It's about telling truth. You see that, don't you? You see past the surface. Tiffany had nodded, not quite understanding but feeling the weight of her words. Most people draw faces, Claire continued, leaning close to study his work. But you draw souls. Don't ever lose that gift. The world needs people who can see what's really there. For 3 years, every Thursday, Claire taught him. Not just technique, though she showed him how to shade and proportion, how to capture light and shadow. She taught him how to observe, how to notice the tilt of a head that betrayed sadness, the tension in shoulders that spoke of burden, the way someone's hands moved when they were lying. People wear masks, she'd say. Your job is to draw what's underneath. That's where the real person lives, in the parts they try to hide. She was patient with his questions, generous with her supplies, fierce in her belief that talent mattered more than circumstance. She never told him about her life outside Riverside, never mentioned that she was the wife of one of Chicago's wealthiest collectors. To Tiffany, she was just Mrs. Harvey, the only adult who made him feel like he mattered. Then, 2 weeks after his 11th birthday, she stopped coming. The orphanage director, Ms. Patterson, called him into her office. Mrs. Harvey passed away, she'd said gently. Cancer. It was very sudden. The world had tilted then, the ground unsteady beneath Tiffany's feet. He'd lost people before, foster placements that didn't work out, friends who got adopted and never looked back. But losing Claire felt different. She'd been the mirror that showed him who he could become. A week later, a package arrived. Inside was a wooden box containing Claire's personal pencil set, worn, used, some ground down to nubs. There were charcoals, graphite sticks, erasers shaped by years of work. At the bottom lay a note in her elegant handwriting, Tiffany. These tools created truth for 30 years. Now they're yours. Draw what others won't see. Draw until the world has no choice but to look. Remember, if you ever meet a man who hides behind mirrors, draw his truth. He needs it more than he knows. You see souls, dear one. Never stop. C.H. Tiffany had traced her initials with his finger, memorizing the loops and curves. He didn't understand the part about the man and mirrors, but he understood the rest. She'd given him permission to be what he was, an artist who saw too much. Life at Riverside grew harder after that. Budget cuts meant fewer programs, And at 13, Tiffany was aging out of the system's limited opportunities. Foster families wanted younger children, easier children, children who didn't spend every free moment drawing instead of talking. So, 6 months ago, when Ms. Patterson told him they'd found him a placement in a group home across the city, Tiffany made a different choice. He packed Claire's pencils, 2 sketch pads, a change of clothes, and walked out of the only home he'd ever known. The streets were cruel, but honest. At least out here, nobody pretended to care. Nobody made promises they wouldn't keep. He survived by doing what Claire taught him. He drew portraits for tourists, caricatures for tips, sketches of the city that he sold to coffee shops for $20 each. He slept in shelters when he could, in subway stations when he couldn't. He learned which cops would leave him alone and which restaurants threw out good food at closing time. But every drawing, whether it earned him $5 or nothing, followed Claire's teaching. Draw the truth. Draw the soul. Draw what's hidden. The museum steps had become his spot 3 weeks ago. The location was perfect. Enough foot traffic for business, shelter from the wind, and the proximity to art, even if he couldn't afford to go inside. Sometimes he'd sketch the sculptures visible through the glass doors, imagining what Claire would say about their composition. He'd never expected to meet the man who owned the building, had never imagined that Jack Harvey, the name on the museum's facade, the face from charity galas and art magazines, would be the one to issue a challenge that felt both like opportunity and trap. While Tiffany settled into the shelter that night, counting and recounting the money Jack Harvey had thrown at him, a different scene unfolded across town in the penthouse suite of Harvey Tower. Jack Harvey stood before his bathroom mirror, loosening his burgundy tie. The face that looked back at him was the same one Chicago magazine had called the kingmaker of contemporary art. Strong jawline, steel gray eyes, the kind of distinguished features that commanded respect and inspired fear in equal measure. He barely recognized it anymore. The man in the mirror had become a stranger. Especially in quiet moments like these, when there was no audience to perform for, no image to maintain. Behind the polished exterior lived someone else entirely. Someone who'd been hiding for so long that he'd forgotten what truth looked like. Jack's penthouse was a monument to taste and wealth. Original Basquiat's on the walls, a Steinway grand piano that no one played, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city. Every piece carefully curated, every surface pristine. It was a museum, not a home, just like its owner. His motto, printed on every Harvey Foundation brochure, said it all. Art belongs to those who can afford to understand it. It was the philosophy that had built his empire. Exclusive galleries, invitation-only exhibitions, prices that ensured only the wealthy could participate. He'd turned art into luxury, access into privilege, beauty into commodity. Claire would have hated what he'd become, but Claire was gone, dead 2 years now, taking with her the only part of him that had ever been genuine. She'd spent their final months not at his side, but at some orphanage on the south side, teaching children who couldn't afford even basic supplies. He'd argued with her about it. "Why waste your energy on kids who'll never amount to anything?" he'd said. She'd looked at him with such disappointment. "Because someone has to see them, Jack. Someone has to tell them they matter. You used to understand that." He'd been too busy building his empire to hear her. Now her absence filled his penthouse like a ghost, a constant reminder of everything he'd traded away for success. Jack walked to his study, poured himself a scotch he didn't really want, and stared at the city below. Somewhere down there, That boy from the museum steps was probably cold, probably hungry, definitely regretting his decision to accept an impossible challenge. Good. Let him regret it. Let him lie awake tonight realizing he'd been baited by someone who played games he couldn't win. Jack smiled grimly at his reflection in the window glass. Saturday would be entertaining. 500 witnesses would watch that boy fail. And maybe then, the world would stop sending its strays to his doorstep. He had no way of knowing that the boy sleeping in a shelter across town carried pencils that once belonged to his dead wife. Had no idea that Claire's final project, her masterpiece, as she'd called it, was about to walk through his gallery doors. And he certainly couldn't imagine that in 5 days, a portrait drawn by homeless orphan would reveal the one truth Jack Harvey had spent a decade trying to bury. That behind all his mirrors and masks and carefully constructed facades, he was just a man who'd forgotten how to be human. The game was set. The pieces were in motion. Neither of them was ready for what would happen when a boy who saw souls met a man who'd lost his own. Saturday arrived with the weight of Judgment Day. By 7:30 p.m., the Harvey Art Museum blazed with light. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, depositing Chicago's elite onto the red carpet. Women in gowns that cost more than annual salaries. Men in tuxedos discussing mergers between sips of champagne. The Visions of Greatness Gala was the social event of the season, and everyone who mattered had come to see Jack Harvey's latest acquisition. None of them expected the real show. Tiffany arrived at 7:45 p.m., his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd done his best, borrowed dress pants from the shelter donation bin, scrubbed his face until it was raw, combed his hair with water. His shoes were still scuffed, his jacket still too thin for November. But he'd tried. He carried Claire's pencil box under one arm and his sketch pad under the other, feeling like an imposter about to be exposed. Security stopped him at the entrance. "Invitation?" "Mr. Harvey is expecting me," Tiffany said, surprised his voice didn't shake. The guard spoke into his radio, eyebrows raised. A moment later, Catherine, Harvey's assistant, appeared, her expression somewhere between sympathy and disbelief. "You actually came." "I said I would." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "This way." The museum's grand hall was a cathedral of marble and glass. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors. Servers glided between clusters of guests carrying trays of champagne and canapes. The walls displayed Harvey's new collection, contemporary pieces worth millions, each one spotlit like a jewel. Conversations died as Tiffany walked through. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward like stones thrown into water. "Is that the boy? The one from the street? Harvey actually invited him?" Jack Harvey stood at the center of the room, holding court before a semicircle of admirers. He wore a different suit tonight, midnight blue with silver accents, and his silver hair caught the light like a crown. He looked every inch the king of his domain. When he saw Tiffany, his smile sharpened. "Ah, our guest of honor has arrived." His voice boomed across the hall, pulling everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Tiffany Ehlert, the young artist who so boldly accepted my challenge." Applause scattered through the crowd, polite, curious, tinged with mockery. Phones appeared, recording. This was the entertainment they'd been promised. "Catherine, if you would," Jack gestured grandly. Within moments, staff had arranged an easel at the room's center, angled so the crowd could watch. A stool appeared for Tiffany, positioned to face Jack directly. The terms were simple, Jack announced, pacing like a showman. Young Mr. Ehlert draws me, here and now, in front of all of you. If the portrait is worthy of display in my museum, I adopt him. If not, he paused dramatically, well, we'll save him the embarrassment of spelling out failure. Laughter rippled through the audience. Jack settled onto a high-backed chair, arranging himself in a pose of casual arrogance. One leg crossed, arm draped over the chair's back, chin lifted just enough to look down at the world. Take your time, boy. Show us what you can do. Tiffany opened Claire's pencil box with trembling hands. The familiar weight of her tools steadied him. He selected a piece of charcoal, then a 4B graphite pencil, letting his fingers remember their purpose. Draw the truth, Claire's voice echoed in his memory. Draw what's hidden, he looked at Jack Harvey. Really looked. Beyond the expensive suit and styled hair, beyond the practiced smile and commanding posture. He looked at the eyes, and there he found it. The hairline cracks in the armor. The slight tightness around the mouth that spoke of control rather than confidence. The way Harvey's hands, despite their casual drape, were clenched just enough to show white knuckles. This was a man performing, not living. A man hiding. Tiffany began to draw. The room fell silent except for the whisper of graphite on paper. Guests drifted closer, forming a semicircle behind the easel. Jack maintained his pose, that arrogant smile fixed in place, occasionally glancing around to ensure everyone was watching his triumph. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Tiffany worked in complete focus, the world narrowing to the page before him, and the truth he was capturing. His hand moved with certainty now, Claire's training flowing through muscle memory. Shade here to capture depth, a lighter touch there for vulnerability. The eyes, always the eyes, told the story. He drew not the man posing before him, but the man behind the pose. The widower who'd lost his way. The father who'd buried his grief so deep it had calcified into cruelty. The husband who'd forgotten the woman who'd loved him enough to show him truth. Is he almost finished? Someone whispered. That's quite detailed. Look at the technique. Where did a street kid learn that? Jack's smile tightened. Take your time, boy. Perfection can't be rushed. But Tiffany was already finishing. Final shadows beneath the eyes. A subtle downturn to the mouth that Harvey's actual expression didn't show, but his soul carried. A heaviness in the gaze that no amount of wealth or power could mask. He set down his pencil and exhaled slowly. It's done. The crowd pressed closer. Jack uncrossed his legs, preparing to receive his moment of glory. A portrait he would mock, then graciously refuse to display, sending the boy back to the streets where he belonged. Well then, Jack said, standing. Let's see this masterpiece. Tiffany turned the sketchpad around. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull all the oxygen from the room. It was Jack Harvey's face, undeniably him, the strong jawline, the silver hair, the aristocratic features. But the expression was nothing like the man who'd been posing. The eyes in the portrait held profound loss, the kind of grief that drowns slowly over years. The mouth curved not in arrogance, but in barely suppressed pain. Every line, every shadow spoke of a man carrying unbearable weight, wearing a mask that was finally slipping. It was the face of a father who'd watched his child's coffin lowered into the ground. The face of a man who'd chosen wealth over humanity. and was dying from the choice. The face Jack Harvey showed only to his mirror at 3 a.m., when the scotch stopped working. "My God," someone whispered. Jack's confident smile collapsed. Color drained from his face. He stared at the portrait like it was a ghost made real, his mouth opening and closing without sound. His hand reached toward it, then pulled back as if burned. "How?" he breathed. "How could you—" "Sir?" Catherine stepped forward, alarmed. A woman in an emerald gown leaned toward her companion. "That's the expression he wore at Daniel's funeral. I remember it exactly. But how could this boy know? He's never met Jack before." Maybe someone told him, "No, look at the detail." The loss in those eyes, that's not second-hand information. That's seeing. Phones were raised everywhere now, recording. The moment would be viral within the hour. #DrawMeJack, they'd call it. The billionaire undone by a child's pencil. Jack's breathing came ragged. His carefully constructed world was cracking, all his mirrors shattering at once. 500 people were seeing what he'd spent a decade hiding. The broken man beneath the mogul. The father beneath the philanthropist. The truth beneath the lie. "You had no right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, trembling with something between rage and anguish. "You had no right to draw that." Tiffany met his eyes steadily. "You asked me to draw you, Mr. Harvey. I drew what was there." "That's not—" Jack's hands were shaking. "That's not how I posed. That's not what I showed you." "No, sir," Tiffany said quietly. "But it's what I saw." The room was utterly silent. Catherine touched Jack's elbow gently, but he jerked away. His face had gone from pale to flushed, emotions warring visibly across his features. Humiliation, rage, grief, recognition. He looked around at the crowd, at their stunned faces, at the phones still recording his unraveling. Then back at the portrait that had somehow reached inside him and pulled out the one thing he'd sworn to keep buried. "This gala is over," Jack said, his voice hollow. "Everyone out. Now." "Mr. Harvey," Catherine began. "Out!" The word echoed off marble walls. Guests stood frozen, uncertain. Then slowly, they began to move toward the exits, murmuring, still filming, nobody wanting to miss a moment of this spectacular disaster. Jack Harvey, the man who'd built an empire on control and cultivated image, turned and walked away from his own gala, leaving behind a room full of witnesses and a portrait that told truths he'd never meant to confess. Tiffany stood alone by the easel, Claire's pencils scattered on the table beside him, watching the crowd disperse. He'd done what she taught him. He'd drawn the soul, not the face. He just hadn't expected it to hurt so much, for both of them. The first video went live at 9:47 p.m., posted by Margaret Chen, a tech entrepreneur who'd been standing 3 feet from the easel. Her caption was simple: "Billionaire challenges homeless kid to draw him. You won't believe what happens next. Draw me, Jack." By 10:15 p.m., it had 50,000 views. By midnight, 2 million. By Sunday morning, the number had climbed past 15 million. And at Draw Me Jack was trending #1 worldwide. The videos came from every angle. Dozens of guests had filmed the moment. Some caught Jack's confident pose dissolving into shock. Others zoomed in on the portrait itself, that haunting expression of grief, frozen in graphite and charcoal. A few captured the whispered conversations, the gasps, The way Jack's hands had trembled before he fled his own gala. The internet was merciless and swift in its judgment. Imagine being so cruel you publicly humiliate a child, then getting destroyed by his talent, read one viral tweet with 400,000 likes. This boy saw through a billionaire's mask in 30 minutes. What else is Jack Harvey hiding? Another asked. TikTok exploded with reaction videos. Art students analyzed the portrait's technique. Look at the shading around the eyes. That's not amateur work. That's someone who understands emotional depth. Psychology influencers dissected the confrontation. Harvey's response is classic narcissistic collapse. The boy held up a mirror he couldn't face. By Sunday afternoon, major news outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled Art, Arrogance, and Accountability. The Chicago Tribune published an editorial. When did we allow billionaires to toy with children? Entertainment. Tonight framed it as class warfare, street artist versus art mogul, David and Goliath for the social media age. The backlash hit Jack Harvey like a tidal wave. By Monday morning, 3 major sponsors had withdrawn from the Harvey Foundation. Ameribank released a terse statement. We do not align our brand with individuals who mock vulnerable youth. Tech giant Lumina followed. After reviewing recent events, we are redirecting our philanthropic partnerships. Even the Chicago Arts Council, which Harvey had chaired for 6 years, issued a carefully worded message about reevaluating leadership priorities. Harvey's publicist, Marcus Wade, worked overtime trying to contain the damage. Mr. Harvey's charitable contributions to the arts are well documented, he told reporters gathered outside Harvey Tower Monday morning. This was simply a misunderstanding amplified by social media. Was it a misunderstanding when he told a homeless child he'd fail? A reporter interrupted. Did he expect to humiliate that boy publicly? What does this say about how the wealthy view poverty? Marcus raised his hands, but the questions kept coming. A firing squad of accountability. Inside his penthouse, Jack Harvey watched the press conference on muted television, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. His phone had been ringing non-stop for 36 hours. Board members demanding damage control. Lawyers advising statements. Society friends suddenly unreachable. Even Catherine had started screening his calls, her usual efficiency tinged with something new. Disappointment, maybe, or disillusionment. The worst part wasn't the sponsors or the headlines. It was the way the portrait had spread like wildfire, screenshotted and shared millions of times. Strangers across the world were analyzing his grief, dissecting his pain, seeing the parts of himself he'd spent a decade burying. Who taught this kid to draw like that? One viral thread asked. Where is he now? Someone find him. He deserves a real art education, not some billionaire's cruel games. Questions Jack couldn't answer because he'd never bothered to ask. Tiffany learned about the chaos on Monday afternoon, in the common room of St. Vincent's shelter. He'd spent Sunday in a fog, sleeping late after the emotional exhaustion of Saturday night. He'd hidden the portrait under his mattress, unable to look at it, unsure what he'd captured or why it had affected Harvey so profoundly. When other shelter residents asked where he'd been Saturday night, he'd muttered something about a gallery event and changed the subject. But Monday, one of the volunteers, a college student named Deshaun, burst into the common room with his phone held high. Yo, Tiff! Tiff! Is this you? The video was already playing. Tiffany turning the portrait around, the crowd gasping, Harvey's face collapsing. The view count had just crossed 20 million. Holy shit, that is you! Deshaun was practically bouncing. You're famous, man. You're all over the internet. Other residents crowded around, phones appearing. Within minutes, Tiffany was surrounded by screens showing his own face, his own hands drawing, his quiet voice saying, "I drew what was there." The comments sections scrolled endlessly. "This kid is incredibly talented. Someone get him in art school now. Jack Harvey should be ashamed. Where can we donate to help this boy?" Tiffany felt his chest tighten. This wasn't what he wanted. He'd just drawn truth, the way Claire taught him. He didn't want to be famous or viral or a symbol of anything. He certainly didn't want strangers dissecting his work, analyzing his technique, turning his art into ammunition against Harvey. "Tiff, people are trying to find you," Deshawn said, scrolling through Twitter. "There's like 1,000 people asking where you are, if you need help." "I don't want help." Tiffany stood abruptly, his chair scraping concrete. "I don't want any of this." He retreated to the sleeping area, pulling the portrait from under his mattress. In the harsh fluorescent light, he studied it again, those eyes filled with loss, that mouth curved in hidden pain. He'd drawn what he saw, but now, looking closer, something else emerged from the shadows. The way the grief sat in Harvey's expression, it reminded him of someone. The tightness around the eyes, the weight in the gaze. He'd seen that look before, in photographs, in Claire's eyes, in the last months before she died. The similarity unsettled him. Why would a millionaire art mogul carry the same grief as a dying woman who'd spent her final days teaching orphans? What connected them besides wealth and art? His phone, a battered prepaid model, buzzed. Then again and again. Somehow, someone had found his number. Messages flooded in. "Is this Tiffany Ehlert? We'd like to interview you for... I'm a talent agent interested in... Chicago Tribune would love to hear your side." He powered it off, heart racing. This was spiraling beyond his control. All he'd done was draw truth. Why did truth have to explode into this? That same Monday night, Jack Harvey sat alone in his study, the lights of Chicago spreading below him like scattered diamonds. His publicist had advised him to release a statement, apologize, spin the narrative toward redemption. His lawyers wanted him to claim the challenge was misunderstood. His board demanded he contain the PR disaster. Instead, Jack stared at his laptop screen, frozen on a screenshot someone had posted to Twitter. A high-resolution image of the portrait, every detail visible. He'd looked at it 100 times now, unable to look away. The longer he stared, the more he saw. Not just his own hidden grief, but something else in the technique, in the way the boy had captured emotion through shadow and line. It was familiar, terribly, impossibly familiar. Jack's hand trembled as he opened a drawer in his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio he hadn't touched in 2 years. Inside were Claire's final sketches, pieces she'd created during her last months, when the cancer was winning, but she refused to stop creating. He spread them across his desk. A portrait of a nurse, exhaustion captured in the slump of her shoulders. A sketch of children playing, joy rendered in loose, confident strokes. A self-portrait, where her eyes held acceptance and peace and goodbye. The technique was unmistakable. The way she used shadow to convey emotion. The attention to hands as storytelling tools. The eyes, always the eyes first, because they held truth. Jack pulled up the viral image again, zooming in on details. The shading technique around the jaw, the way highlights suggested depth. The graphite work that gave the portrait almost photographic quality while remaining distinctly artistic. This wasn't just talent. This was training, specific, intentional, methodical training. Claire's training. "No," Jack whispered to his empty study. "It's not possible." But even as he denied it, his eyes found another detail. In the bottom right corner of the portrait, barely visible in the viral image, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. A small signature. T. Ehlert. And beneath it, smaller still, almost invisible. For C.H. Jack's breath caught. C.H. Claire Harvey. His hands shook as he opened another drawer, pulling out the box of Claire's personal effects he'd never been able to sort through. Letters, photographs, her calendar from those final months. He flipped through pages frantically until he found what he was looking for. Her Thursday appointments. 2:05 p.m., Riverside Orphanage, art class. Week after week after week. For years. Right up until she'd been too weak to leave the house. Jack grabbed his phone, dialing Catherine despite the late hour. She answered on the third ring, voice cautious. "Mr. Harvey?" "The boy," Jack said, his voice rough. "Tiffany Ehlert. Find out everything. Where he's from, where he learned to draw, who taught him, everything." A pause. "Sir, at this hour—" "Now, Catherine, please." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "I'll make some calls." Jack ended the call and returned to the portrait, his reflection visible in the laptop screen behind the image. Two faces, his real one, carefully composed and controlled, and the one the boy had drawn. Raw, honest, broken. The boy had said he drew what was there. But how could he have known? How could a street kid who'd never met Jack Harvey capture not just grief, but the specific grief of a man who'd lost his son? The exact expression from a funeral 10 years ago? Unless someone had taught him. Someone who'd known that expression intimately. Someone who'd loved Jack enough to see past his masks, even when he'd stopped letting her. Claire. The realization hit him like a physical blow. That boy wasn't just some random street artist. He was Claire's student. Maybe her last student. The one she'd called her masterpiece in those final fevered weeks when Jack had been too busy with board meetings to listen. "You found a boy who could heal people with graphite," Jack had scoffed when she'd mentioned it. "That's the morphine talking." Claire. But it hadn't been the morphine. It had been truth. And now that truth had walked into his gallery, accepted his cruel challenge, and drawn the one portrait Jack Harvey could never escape. Jack Harvey hadn't entered Claire's studio in 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days. It was 3:47 a.m. Tuesday morning when he finally stood before the door at the end of the hall, his hand hovering over the brushed steel handle. He'd walked past this door every day for 852 days, always looking straight ahead, pretending it didn't exist. The room beyond had become a mausoleum, and he its reluctant keeper. But tonight, this morning, he couldn't stay away. The key still hung on his keyring, a small brass thing he'd never removed despite having no intention of using it. His hands shook as he fitted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silent penthouse. The door swung open. Moonlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space Claire had called her sanctuary. The air smelled of old paint and linseed oil. A ghost of creativity passed. Easels stood like sentinels, some holding blank canvases, others displaying works she'd never finished. Her brushes rested in glass jars, handles pointing upward like accusatory fingers, everything exactly as she'd left it. Jack stepped inside, his chest tight. Catherine had offered to pack up the studio, donate the supplies, close this chapter. He'd refused, not out of sentiment, but cowardice. Closing the studio would mean accepting Claire was gone. Leaving it untouched meant he could pretend she'd just stepped out, might return any moment with paint-stained fingers and that knowing smile. He moved through the space slowly, trailing fingers across work tables. A palette with dried acrylics, colors she'd mixed but never used, sketchbooks stacked in careful piles, photographs pinned to a corkboard, Daniel as a toddler, their wedding day, candid shots of strangers she'd found beautiful. And in the corner, covered with a white sheet, an easel that held something. Jack's throat constricted. He knew that shape, a large canvas, the kind Claire used for serious work. He'd never looked beneath the sheet, had been too afraid of what final message she might have left. But tonight, with Tiffany Ehlert's portrait burned into his brain and the weight of recognition pressing down on him, he reached for the cloth. It whispered as it fell away. The painting was unfinished, background sketched in charcoal, some areas filled with color, others bare canvas. But the subject was complete, rendered with all of Claire's considerable skill. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, sat on a windowsill in what looked like an institutional room. Weak sunlight fell across his face as he hunched over a sketchpads, pencil moving across paper. His clothes were threadbare, his hair needed cutting, but his expression held intense focus and something else, a desperate hunger to capture truth on paper. The face was unmistakable. Tiffany Ehlert, 3 years younger but already carrying those same observant eyes, that same quiet intensity. Jack staggered backward, his hip hitting a table. Brushes clattered to the floor. "My God," he whispered. She'd painted him. Claire had painted the boy who would walk into Jack's gallery years later and expose his soul. She'd known him, taught him, cared enough to immortalize him in oils. Jack's eyes found a date in the corner. Spring 2022, the year before she died. He turned frantically, searching the studio. There had to be more. Notes, sketches, something to explain this connection. His hands rifled through drawers, disturbing years of dust. He found studies of hands, street scenes, portraits of people he didn't recognize. Then, in the bottom drawer of her work desk, he found it. Claire's journal. She'd kept one for every year they'd been married. Leather-bound books where she recorded thoughts, sketches, observations. He'd never read them, respecting her privacy even after death. But now he pulled out the final volume, dated 2023, and flipped through pages with shaking hands. Most entries were mundane. Notes about techniques she wanted to try, reflections on color theory, grocery lists mixed with philosophical musings. Then, about halfway through. March 14th, 2023. Started teaching at Riverside Orphanage today. Jack thinks I'm wasting my time, but there's a boy there, Tiffany, who reminds me so much of Daniel, it hurts. Not in appearance, but in the way he sees the world. He draws constantly, obsessively, the way Daniel used to build things, creating as a way of understanding. He's been at Riverside since infancy. Nobody wanted him, so he stopped wanting to be wanted. But when I showed him how to shade properly, how to capture light, his whole face changed. Like I'd given him a language he'd been searching for his whole life. I see Daniel in him, the curiosity, the quiet intensity. Maybe that's why I can't stay away. Jack's vision blurred. He blinked hard and kept reading. June 7th, 2023. Tiffany asked me today why I waste time teaching kids like him. Kids like you? I asked. Kids nobody wants, he said, so matter-of-factly it broke my heart. I told him what I should have told Jack years ago. Art isn't about want. It's about need. We need people who can see truth and make others see it too. We need people who can take pain and transform it into something beautiful. He didn't understand, but someday he will. I'm teaching him everything I know. If these are my last years, and we both know they are, I want to leave something behind. Someone who carries forward the belief that art matters, that seeing matters, that truth matters. Jack has forgotten all of that. He's turned art into commodity, beauty into investment. Maybe if I can teach one child differently, I can balance the scales somehow. July entries detailed Tiffany's progress, how quickly he learned, his natural ability to capture emotion, the way other children responded to his work. August 23, 2023. Tiffany drew me today. I didn't ask him to, but he insisted. When he showed me the sketch, I cried. He'd drawn not my face, but my spirit. Tired, yes, but still hoping, still believing, still seeing beauty in broken things. He draws the world as it truly is, not as we wish it were, not as we pretend it is, just true. He reminds me of Daniel. God, he reminds me so much of my son. Jack's hands trembled so badly, he nearly dropped the journal. Claire had found a replacement for Daniel. Not consciously, maybe not even acknowledged, but she'd poured all her grief and love and hope into teaching this orphaned boy. The final entry was dated December 2023, 2 weeks before she died. I gave Tiffany my pencil set today. Jack will be furious if he finds out. They're worth thousands, but money is the least important thing about them. They've created truth for 30 years. Now they'll continue. I told him, if you ever meet a man who hides behind mirrors, draw his truth. He needs it more than he knows. I was talking about Jack, of course, my brilliant, broken husband who's forgotten how to be human, who's buried his grief so deep he's suffocating on it. Maybe someday Tiffany will draw him. Maybe that portrait will be the mirror Jack can't look away from. Maybe it will save him. I hope so, because I won't be here to do it myself. The journal slipped from Jack's hands. Pages splaying across the floor. He stood in his dead wife's studio, surrounded by her final works, staring at a portrait of the boy he'd mocked and humiliated. Claire had known. She'd known that her student and her husband would meet someday, had practically orchestrated it with her final instructions. She'd given Tiffany the tools and the mission. Draw his truth. And the boy had done exactly that. Jack sank onto a paint-stained stool, his face in his hands. The weight of recognition crushed down on him. Not just who Tiffany was, but what Jack had become. A man so twisted by grief that he'd turned cruel. A man who'd forgotten the woman he loved, had believed in kindness, in seeing potential in the unseen. A man who'd publicly humiliated his dead wife's greatest student. While Jack Harvey confronted ghosts in a silent studio, Tiffany Ehlert faced a different kind of haunting at St. Vincent's shelter. Reporters had found him. By Tuesday morning, 3 news vans were parked outside, cameras pointed at the entrance. Journalists called the shelter's main line every 10 minutes. Someone had leaked photos of Tiffany's other sketches, pieces he'd sold for $20 that now circulated online, analyzed by art critics as proof of generational talent. "Tiffany!" a reporter shouted when he tried to leave for breakfast. "How does it feel to take down a billionaire? Did you know you'd humiliate Jack Harvey? What's your next move?" Tiffany ducked back inside, heart pounding. This wasn't what he wanted. None of this was what he wanted. Lydia Torres, the shelter's social worker, found him in the stairwell 20 minutes later. She was a short woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. The kind of person who'd seen too much to be shocked, but still cared enough to act. "Come on," she said gently. "I've got you in a back office, away from the windows." The office was cramped, but quiet. Lydia handed him a cup of hot chocolate and sat across from him, her expression serious. "You know what's happening out there?" "I don't want it," Tiffany said immediately. "I don't want to be famous. I just wanted to prove—" He stopped, searching for words. "That poor doesn't mean powerless?" Lydia finished. Tiffany nodded, throat tight. Lydia sighed. "I believe you, but intention doesn't control outcome. You've started something bigger than yourself now. Jack Harvey's empire is shaking. People are asking questions about wealth, power, how we treat vulnerable children. You're a symbol whether you want to be or not." "I just drew what I saw." "I know," she leaned forward. "And that's exactly why this matters. You saw through him, Tiffany. You saw the man behind the money, and you showed everyone else. That's terrifying to people like Harvey." Tiffany clutched the hot chocolate, letting warmth seep into his cold hands. "Mrs. Harvey, Claire. She taught me to draw truth. She said people need to see it." Lydia's eyes sharpened. "Claire Harvey? The billionaire's wife?" "She was my teacher at Riverside Orphanage." Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "She died 2 years ago. I didn't know she was married to him until after, when I saw his name on the museum." "Oh, honey." Lydia's expression softened with understanding and sorrow. "So when he challenged you, I thought if I could draw him the way she taught me, maybe—" Tiffany's voice cracked. "Maybe she'd be proud. Maybe I could prove she wasn't wrong about me." "She wasn't wrong." Lydia's voice was firm. "But you need to understand something about men like Jack Harvey. They don't apologize. They don't admit fault. They purchase redemption. If he reaches out, and he will, the publicity is killing him. He'll try to buy your silence, your forgiveness, your story." "I don't want his money." "Good, because the moment you take it, you lose your power." Lydia stood, moving to the window. Outside, more news vans were arriving. "This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. You need to decide what you want from this: justice, vindication, or just to be left alone." Tiffany thought about Claire's note, hidden in his pencil box. "If you ever meet a man who hides behind mirrors, draw his truth. He needs it more than he knows." He'd drawn the truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. "I want to be left alone," he said quietly. "I want to draw. I want to honor Mrs. Harvey's teaching. That's all." Lydia nodded, but her expression said she knew that wish was impossible now. The world had seen Tiffany Ehlert, and it wouldn't look away. Jack Harvey arrived at St. Vincent's Shelter at 2:30 p.m. Tuesday afternoon in a black town car that looked obscenely out of place among the cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. He emerged wearing a charcoal suit, understated by his standards, and carrying a mahogany frame that held Tiffany's portrait. now professionally matted and preserved behind museum-quality glass. The reporters descended like vultures. "Mr. Harvey, are you here to apologize? Is this damage control? What do you have to say to Tiffany Ehlert?" Jack ignored them all, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the shelter's entrance. 2 security guards from his personal detail cleared a path. Catherine followed 3 steps behind, her phone pressed to her ear, already managing the optics of this visit. Inside, Lydia Torres met them in the lobby, arms crossed. "Mr. Harvey, I wondered when you'd show up. I need to speak with the boy." Jack's voice was steady, but something underneath betrayed him. Urgency, maybe, or desperation poorly masked. "He doesn't want to see you." Nevertheless, Jack's tone hardened into the commanding register that usually ended arguments. "I've come a long way. You've come 12 blocks. Lydia didn't budge. "And that boy has been through enough without you bringing your guilt and your checkbook into our shelter." Jack's expression flickered, surprised that someone would speak to him this way, then something darker. "Ms. Torres, I can make a substantial donation to this facility. New beds, better kitchen equipment, funding for your programs. Is that how you fix everything? Write checks until people stop being inconvenient?" Lydia's voice was sharp. "That boy isn't for sale. I'm not trying to buy him. I'm trying to make things right." "Then start by respecting his wishes. He doesn't want to see you." A voice came from the stairwell behind Lydia. "It's okay, Ms. Torres. I'll talk to him." Tiffany stood on the landing, gripping the railing. He looked smaller than he had at the gala. Younger, more vulnerable in the harsh fluorescent light, but his eyes held steady as they met Jack's. Lydia turned, her expression protective. "Tiffany, you don't have to—" "I know." Tiffany descended the stairs slowly. "But maybe I should." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Conference room. Door stays open. I'll be right outside." The conference room was a cramped space, with a scarred table and mismatched chairs. Motivational posters peeled from the walls. "Every day is a new beginning. You are stronger than you think." Jack set the framed portrait on the table between them, the glass catching overhead light. For a long moment, neither spoke. They sat across from each other like adversaries at a negotiation. The portrait, a silent witness. "You framed it?" Tiffany finally said. "Professional conservation. Archival materials. It's worth—" Jack stopped himself. "It deserves to be preserved properly." "What?" The question hung in the air. Jack looked at the portrait, his own grief staring back at him through graphite and shadow. "Because it's the most honest thing anyone has shown me in 10 years. Tiffany's jaw tightened. "You didn't want honesty. You wanted humiliation." "Yes." The admission came out flat, unapologetic in its honesty. "I wanted to embarrass you, to prove that talent without pedigree, without training, without money, was just pretension, street performance. I wanted my guests to laugh at you." "Quick." Jack's hands clenched on the table. "Because it was easier than seeing you. Easier than acknowledging that someone like you, someone with nothing, could create something real, while I've spent millions collecting other people's truth." Tiffany studied him with those 2 observant eyes. "You didn't see me that day. You saw something you hated in yourself." The words landed like physical blows. Jack's breath caught. "You have no right to psychoanalyze me. You're a child." "I'm an artist. Mrs. Harvey taught me that's the same thing." seeing what people hide. Tiffany's voice remained calm, but his hands trembled slightly. You hide behind your money, your museum, your reputation. You hide so well you forgot what was underneath. Until I drew it. You drew my guilt. Jack's voice cracked on the last word. My private grief. No one should have seen that. No one had the right. You gave me the right when you challenged me to draw you. Tiffany leaned forward. You said draw something worth displaying. I drew the truth. That's what worth looks like. It's not pretty, but it's real. Jack stood abruptly, his chair scraping concrete. He paced to the window, his back to Tiffany. Outside, news vans still lined the street. Cameras pointed at the building. His empire crumbling, broadcast in real time. I came here to offer you something, Jack said, his voice low. A place at the Chicago Academy of Art. Full scholarship, housing, materials. The best instructors in the country. Everything you need to develop your talent properly. And in exchange? Jack turned, his expression carefully neutral. A statement that the gala was a misunderstanding, that I meant to support you all along. That the video doesn't show the full context. You want me to lie. I want us both to move forward. Tiffany shook his head slowly. You're doing exactly what Ms. Torres said you'd do. Trying to purchase redemption. Trying to make me your charity case so you look generous instead of cruel. That's not... Jack stopped, because it was. It was exactly that. What do you want then? Money? A gallery showing? Name it. I want you to leave. Tiffany's voice was quiet but firm. I want you to stop trying to fix this with things I never asked for. I don't want your academy, or your money, or your redemption story. Jack stared at him, this boy who'd somehow accumulated more dignity in 13 years of nothing than Jack had managed in 52 years of everything. Why did you accept the challenge? If you didn't want anything from me, why come to the gala at all? Tiffany's expression softened slightly, grief flickering across his features. Because my teacher told me that if I ever met a man who hides behind mirrors, I should draw his truth. She said he'd need it more than he knew. He paused. I thought if I could do that, if I could honor her teaching one more time, maybe it would mean something. Maybe she'd be proud. Jack's chest constricted. Your teacher. Mrs. Harvey, Claire Harvey. Tiffany said the name like a prayer. She taught me everything. How to see past faces to souls. How to capture emotion in shadow. How to make art that matters. His voice thickened. She died 2 years ago, and I never got to thank her properly. Never got to show her that I listened, that I learned. When you challenged me, I thought... He stopped, blinking hard. I thought it was my chance to prove she wasn't wrong about me. The room tilted. Jack gripped the back of his chair for support. Claire was your teacher. At Riverside Orphanage. Every Thursday for 3 years. Tiffany's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. Like my art mattered. She gave me her pencils before she died, told me to keep drawing truth even when it hurt. Jack's vision blurred. He saw it all suddenly, the complete picture he'd been too blind to see. Claire spending her final healthy years at that orphanage, pouring her knowledge into children Jack had dismissed as worthless. Finding this boy, recognizing his gift, nurturing it with the same fierce love she'd shown Daniel. Creating her masterpiece not on canvas, but in the soul of an orphaned child. Your teacher, Jack whispered. Your teacher was my wife. Tiffany froze, his face draining of color. What? Claire Harvey. She was… Jack couldn't finish the sentence. His throat had closed around the words, around the magnitude of cosmic cruelty that had brought them together this way. No, Tiffany stood, shaking his head. No, she never mentioned you. Never said she was married to… He backed toward the door. You're lying. I wish I were. Jack pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and found a photo. Him and Claire at a charity gala 5 years ago, before Daniel died. Before grief carved trenches into both their faces. They looked happy. They looked like people who still believed in joy. He showed Tiffany the screen. Tiffany stared at the image, his breathing shallow. Recognition dawned slowly, painfully. That's Mrs. Harvey. That's her. He looked up at Jack, betrayal and confusion warring in his expression. She was married to you? All that time, she was teaching orphans while I built my empire? Yes. Jack pocketed his phone. She never told me about you specifically, just that she'd found students with potential. I thought she was wasting her time. His voice broke. I told her that. I told my dying wife she was wasting her time teaching children who'd never amount to anything. Tiffany sank back into his chair, looking gutted. She loved you. She had this sadness sometimes when she thought we weren't watching, like she missed someone so much it hurt to breathe. He looked at Jack with dawning horror. She missed you, and you didn't even care that she was… Don't! Jack's voice came out raw. Don't tell me what I didn't care about. I loved her. I failed her, but I loved her. She told me once, Tiffany said quietly, that she'd found a boy who could heal people with graphite. A boy who saw the world clearly enough to show others what they refused to see. He met Jack's eyes. She was talking about me, and you never believed her. No. The admission cost Jack everything. I never believed her. Silence filled the space between them, heavy, aching, full of Claire's ghost. Two people she'd loved, connected by her death and divided by Jack's cruelty. The portrait sat on the table between them, a third witness to this confrontation. I believe her now, Jack finally said. God help me, I believe her now. Tiffany wiped his eyes roughly. You should go. Tiffany, please. The boy's voice cracked. Just go. Jack picked up the framed portrait, then set it back down. Keep it. It's yours. You created it. He moved toward the door, then paused. She was right about you. I didn't see it then, but she was right. He left the shelter the same way he'd entered, surrounded by cameras, guards clearing his path. But something had shifted. He'd arrived wanting to buy silence, to restore his reputation, to control the narrative. He left knowing he'd destroyed the one good thing Claire had created after their son died. Knowing that the boy she'd called her masterpiece now hated him. Knowing that no amount of money could purchase forgiveness for that. Behind him, in a cramped conference room, Tiffany Alert sat alone with a portrait that had started as an act of love and ended as a confession neither of them was ready to hear. 5 days passed before Jack Harvey returned to St. Vincent's shelter. 5 days during which the media frenzy slowly cooled, redirecting its attention to the next scandal. 5 days during which Jack sat in Claire's studio, reading her journals cover to cover, studying every sketch she'd made of her students. 5 days during which Tiffany avoided the news, avoided social media, avoided anything that reminded him of the connection between the woman who'd saved him and the man who'd tried to destroy him. When Jack's town car pulled up Thursday afternoon, there were no reporters waiting, no cameras, no security detail, just Catherine in the driver's seat and Jack in the back, looking somehow smaller than he had before. Lydia met him at the door, her expression wary. "Mr. Harvey, I'm not here to offer money." Jack's voice was quiet, stripped of its usual command. "Or scholarships or statements. I need to show him something of Claire's." Lydia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Wait here." She returned 5 minutes later with Tiffany, who looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His hands were stained with charcoal. He'd been drawing obsessively, the only way he knew to process emotion. "He wants to show you something," Lydia said gently. "At his home. You don't have to go, but—" "It's about Mrs. Harvey," Jack interrupted. "Things she created. Things I think you should see." Tiffany's jaw tightened. "Why would I go anywhere with you?" "Because Claire loved you enough to teach you everything she knew." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "And I was too blind to see what that meant. Too proud to honor it. But I see it now." He paused. "Please, 1 hour. If you want to leave after that, Catherine will drive you back. No strings, no expectations." Tiffany looked at Lydia, who raised her eyebrows. "Your choice." 1 hour, Tiffany finally said. Harvey Mansion sat in Lincoln Park, a limestone fortress behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Tiffany had seen it in magazines, one of Chicago's historic estates worth tens of millions. But seeing it in person, stepping from the car onto cobblestone driveway, was different. This wasn't just wealth. This was legacy, power, permanence, everything he'd never had. Jack led him inside without fanfare. No grand tour, no showing off. Just quiet hallways lined with art that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Tiffany recognized a Rothko, a Basquiat, a Hockney, masterpieces treated as wallpaper. They walked in silence to the mansion's east wing, where Jack stopped before a set of double doors. "I haven't opened this room since Claire died," he said quietly. "Couldn't bear to. But after reading her journals, after seeing your portrait—" He pushed the doors open. "I realized keeping it locked was just another way of hiding." The gallery beyond took Tiffany's breath away. It was a soaring space, with vaulted ceilings and skylights that filled the room with natural light. But it wasn't the architecture that stunned him. It was the art. Claire's art. Dozens of canvases lined the walls, each one showcasing her distinctive style. Portraits that captured not just faces, but souls. Landscapes that felt alive with emotion. Abstracts that somehow conveyed more truth than realism ever could. "This was her private collection," Jack said, his voice echoing slightly. "Work she created for herself, not for galleries or critics. Work she never sold because it meant too much." Tiffany moved through the space slowly, reverently. He recognized Claire's technique in every brushstroke, her philosophy in every composition. A portrait of an elderly man, joy radiating from his weathered face. A painting of children playing in rain. Pure freedom captured in movement and color. A self-portrait where Claire's eyes held both sorrow and acceptance. Then he saw it. The painting from Jack's description. The boy on the windowsill sketching alone. Himself, 3 years younger. Tiffany stopped, his chest constricting. She painted me. She painted all her favorite students, Jack said, gesturing to other canvases. But yours was the last one she completed. She worked on it even when she was too weak to stand for long. She'd sit in her wheelchair and paint for 15 minutes at a time, then rest, then paint again. His voice thickened. I didn't understand why it mattered so much. Didn't understand that she was trying to leave you something. Proof that she saw you, that you mattered to her. Tiffany couldn't look away from the painting. He remembered that day, sitting in Riverside's common room, sketching a pigeon on the fire escape. Claire had been there with her camera, capturing reference photos. He'd thought nothing of it. She called you her masterpiece, Jack continued. I thought she meant the painting, but she meant you. The artist she'd shaped, the truth-teller she'd trained. He moved to stand beside Tiffany, both of them studying the portrait. I mocked her masterpiece. I tried to humiliate her life's work. Why are you showing me this? Tiffany's voice came out hoarse. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he knelt before Tiffany. This powerful man who'd built empires, who'd commanded respect and fear in equal measure, lowering himself to the eye level of a 13-year-old orphan. Because I want to ask you something, Jack said. And I need you to see that I'm asking, not demanding, not buying, just asking. Tiffany stared at him, too shocked to speak. You already drew my face, Jack continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his posture. You saw me clearly enough to capture what I'd spent years hiding. You have Claire's gift, the ability to reveal truth. He paused, swallowing hard. Will you let me draw yours into my life? What does that mean? I don't know yet, Jack admitted. I'm not offering adoption. That would be me trying to buy redemption again, and you'd be right to refuse. I'm not offering to be your father, but maybe, he struggled for words, maybe we could learn from each other. You could teach me what Claire tried to teach me before I lost her, how to see people, how to value truth over image, and I could help you develop your gift. Not at some academy where they'd standardize your vision, but here, with Claire's supplies and her library and her philosophy. You want me to forgive you, Tiffany said flatly. No, Jack shook his head. I don't deserve forgiveness. I want to honor Claire's legacy. She loved us both, separately, in different ways, but genuinely. Maybe if we can learn to exist in the same space without destroying each other, we can keep a piece of her alive. Tiffany looked around the gallery, at Claire's life work, her private truths rendered in oil and canvas. He thought about her journals, her belief in him, her final instructions to draw truth, even when it hurt. What would she want him to do? I need conditions, Tiffany finally said. Jack rose from his knees, hope flickering cautiously in his expression. Name them. I stay at the shelter. I don't move here. Don't become your project or your redemption story. I come here to work, to learn, but I keep my independence. Agreed. You don't control what I create. You don't tell me who to draw or how to draw them. My art stays mine. Absolutely. And if this doesn't work, if you start treating me like charity or like some replacement for what you lost, I walk away. No guilt, no explanations. Jack nodded slowly. Fair terms. Do you have any demands for yourself? The question surprised Tiffany. What? Claire taught you to see others clearly, but she also believed artists should examine themselves just as ruthlessly. Jack's voice was gentle. What will you bring to this arrangement besides suspicion and self-protection? Tiffany bristled, then stopped. It was a fair question. He'd spent 5 days nursing his anger, his sense of betrayal, his resentment. But Claire had taught him that art required openness, vulnerability, the courage to see and be seen. Honesty, he finally said. I'll be honest with you, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you don't want to hear it. I wouldn't expect anything less. Jack extended his hand. 1 hour at a time. We'll see if we can make it work. Tiffany looked at the offered hand, manicured, wealthy, connected to the man who'd tried to humiliate him, but also connected to Claire, to the woman who'd believed in both of them. He shook it. Over the following weeks, an unexpected routine developed. 3 times a week, Tiffany came to the mansion. They worked in Claire's gallery, surrounded by her art, her presence somehow still palpable in the space. Jack set up proper easels, brought out Claire's professional supplies, gave Tiffany access to her entire library of art books and technique guides. But mostly, they drew together in silence. Jack was rusty. He hadn't created art since college, had spent decades collecting rather than making. His first attempts were stiff, self-conscious. Tiffany watched him struggle with a simple still life, and finally said, "You're drawing what you think should be there, not what is there." Jack looked up, startled. "Mrs. Harvey used to say that," Tiffany continued. "People draw their assumptions instead of their observations. You're assuming the apple should be perfectly round, so you're making it that way. But look, really look, it's lopsided. There's a bruise on the left side. Those imperfections are what make it real." Jack studied the apple again, then his drawing. Slowly, he began to adjust, letting go of perfection, embracing truth. In return, Jack taught Tiffany about confidence, not arrogance, but the quiet certainty required to present your work to the world without apology. "You have Claire's gift," he told Tiffany one afternoon, "but you hide it under humility. There's a difference between being humble and making yourself small. She'd want you to stand tall." The art world watched this unlikely partnership with fascination. News of Harvey mentoring the boy he'd once mocked spread quickly. Some called it genuine redemption, others cynical image rehabilitation. But when Jack announced his next exhibit, The Portrait of Truth, featuring both Tiffany's viral drawing and new collaborative works, critics took notice. Perhaps, they whispered, something real was happening in that mansion gallery. Perhaps 2 wounded people were teaching each other how to see clearly again. Perhaps Claire Harvey's final masterpiece wasn't a painting or a person, but a connection she'd orchestrated from beyond the grave, proof that truth, once revealed, has the power to transform even the most broken souls. 6 months transformed everything. The Harvey Art Museum reopened on a mild April evening, its marble halls glowing with soft light that felt different from before, warmer somehow, more inviting. The guest list had changed too. Yes, Chicago's elite were there, but so were artists from Southside Studios, students from community art programs, and a delegation from Riverside Orphanage, including Ms. Patterson and several of Tiffany's former classmates. Lydia Torres stood near the entrance in a borrowed dress, watching the arrivals with cautious optimism. "Never thought I'd set foot in this place," she murmured to Catherine, who'd extended the personal invitation. "Neither did I," Catherine admitted. "Not for an event like this, anyway." Gone were the champagne fountains and caviar stations. In their place, simple refreshments, comfortable seating, and walls that told a different story than before. The exhibit wasn't called Visions of Greatness this time. The banner above the entrance read simply, "The Portrait of Truth, a Journey of Sight and Soul." Tiffany arrived at 7 p.m. sharp, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the tie Jack had helped him choose that afternoon. He wore a simple navy suit, not borrowed this time, but his own, purchased for this occasion. His hair was neatly cut, his shoes new, but already showing signs of the charcoal stains that seemed to follow him everywhere. He looked older than 13. 6 months of proper meals, consistent sleep, and purpose had filled out his frame, brought color to his cheeks. But it was his eyes that showed the real transformation. They held confidence now, the quiet certainty of someone who knew his value. Jack met him in the lobby, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The billionaire and the orphan, the man who'd hidden and the boy who'd revealed. In 6 months, they'd somehow become something neither had expected. Not father and son, but collaborators, truth seekers, students of Claire's philosophy. "Ready?" Jack asked. Tiffany nodded, though his heart hammered. Did you?" "Exactly as you wanted. I haven't changed a thing." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that had taken months to feel natural. "This is your night, Tiffany. Your truth to share." The gallery's main hall had been transformed. Instead of ostentatious displays, the space now felt like a sanctuary. Track lighting created intimate pools of illumination. Benches invited visitors to sit and contemplate. And there, in the center of the room on a simple wooden easel, stood the portrait that had started everything. Tiffany's drawing of Jack Harvey, framed in the same mahogany from that first confrontation at the shelter, now mounted at eye level where everyone could see it clearly. But surrounding it were new pieces, works created over the past 6 months. Collaborative drawings where Jack and Tiffany had worked side by side, learning from each other. Tiffany's portraits of shelter residents, each one capturing dignity in the face of hardship. Jack's sketches, rough but sincere, of the city he'd stopped seeing decades ago and mixed throughout. Claire's works from her private collection, finally shared with the world. The exhibit told a story of blindness and sight, of cruelty and redemption, of a woman whose legacy bridged 2 lives that should never have intersected. Guests arrived in waves, moving through the space with unusual quiet. The atmosphere felt reverent, like a church or memorial. People stopped before each piece, actually reading the placards, actually looking instead of just seeing. At 8 p.m., Jack stepped onto a small platform at the room's center. Conversations faded. Phones appeared, but this time the recording felt different. Not voyeuristic, but documentary, bearing witness to something real. 6 months ago, Jack began, his voice steady but softer than his usual public speaking tone. I stood in this building and committed an act of profound cruelty. I challenged a homeless child to prove his worth, fully expecting, hoping he would fail. He paused, letting the admission settle. I wanted him to fail because his success would expose something I'd spent years hiding. That worth has nothing to do with wealth. That talent doesn't require pedigree. That truth can come from the most unexpected places. Tiffany stood to the side, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Jack with steady attention. But this boy didn't fail, Jack continued. He succeeded in ways I never anticipated. He drew not what I showed him, but what I hid from myself. And in doing so, he gave me an unwanted gift, the chance to see clearly for the first time in a decade. Jack gestured to the central portrait. This drawing destroyed my reputation. Cost me sponsors, board positions, the respect of my peers. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. No carefully crafted PR statement, no sanitized redemption narrative. The artist who created this portrait is here tonight, Jack said. Tiffany Ehlert, would you join me? Tiffany's legs felt unsteady as he crossed to the platform. The crowd's attention pressed against him like a physical weight. He thought of Claire, of her steady encouragement, of her belief that he could do this. When I drew Mr. Harvey 6 months ago, Tiffany began, his voice quieter than Jack's, but clear. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I was doing what my teacher taught me, drawing truth, drawing the soul beneath the surface. He paused, gathering courage. Mrs. Harvey, Claire Harvey, believed that real art reveals what people hide, not to shame them, but to free them, to let them stop pretending. He turned to the portrait, and Jack pressed a small remote. The gallery's main lights dimmed, while a single focused beam illuminated the drawing. There's something in this portrait that nobody has seen, Tiffany continued, something I didn't even realize I'd captured until months later, when I was looking at Mrs. Harvey's photographs and saw her expression in certain moments. The crowd pressed closer. Tiffany pointed to the eyes in the portrait, those grief-stricken eyes that had captured Harvey's hidden pain. Under the right light, if you look closely at the shading here, there's another face reflected in his pupils. Guests leaned in, squinting. Then gasps began to ripple outward as they saw it. Incredibly subtle, barely visible, but undeniably there. The faint outline of a woman's face, rendered in the negative space of graphite shading. Claire's face, captured in microscopic detail within the reflection of Jack's eyes. Because she never stopped looking at you, Tiffany said softly, looking at Jack. Even when you looked away, even when you forgot how to see yourself clearly, she was still there, still watching, still hoping you'd find your way back to truth. Jack's composure shattered. Tears rolled down his cheeks, unwiped, unashamed. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he stared at the portrait, seeing for the first time what Tiffany had somehow captured, not just his grief, but Claire's presence within it, her love persisting beyond death, reflected in the very eyes that had refused to see. The gallery fell absolutely silent, except for Jack's rough breathing. Then he stepped forward, standing beside Tiffany before the portrait they'd both drawn. The boy with his hands, the man through his blind refusal to see clearly. I mocked this boy, Jack said, his voice breaking but determined, to prove I couldn't be seen, to prove I was above scrutiny, above judgment, above truth. But he saw me better than I've ever seen myself. He turned to Tiffany, and he did it with more compassion than I showed him, more mercy than I deserved. Jack faced the audience fully now, tears still streaming, his carefully constructed image finally, completely abandoned. My wife Claire spent her final years teaching children that art is truth, that seeing clearly is a form of love. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought art was commodity, that seeing was possession. His voice strengthened. But standing here now, looking at what her student created, I finally understand. Truth isn't cruel. Pretending is cruel. And the greatest gift anyone can give you is the courage to stop pretending. He extended his hand to Tiffany. Thank you for seeing me, for drawing my truth, for giving me Claire's final lesson." Tiffany took his hand, and together they stood before the portrait while the crowd erupted, not in polite applause, but in genuine, thunderous recognition of something rare. Authentic transformation witnessed in real time. Cameras flashed, but they captured something different than scandal now. They captured vulnerability and reconciliation. They captured a billionaire publicly acknowledging his failure. They captured a boy who'd turned cruelty into compassion through the simple act of drawing truth. Most importantly, they captured Claire's invisible hand in all of it. Her face hidden in reflections, her philosophy woven through every element, her final masterpiece finally complete. Not a painting, not a person, but a connection that proved truth, once revealed, has the power to transform everything. In the crowd, Lydia Torres wiped her eyes. Ms. Patterson hugged former students. Critics furiously revised their cynical takes. And somewhere in the space between art and life, between seeing and being seen, Claire Harvey's legacy lived on. One portrait, one truth, one moment when hiding became impossible and freedom became inevitable. The portrait of truth hung in the center of the room, not as scandal or shame, but as testament to the fact that the bravest thing anyone can do is let themselves be truly seen. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is holding up a mirror, even when, especially when, the reflection shows exactly what we've been trying to hide. December arrived with the kind of crystalline cold that made Chicago's skyline look sharp enough to cut. But inside the newly renovated community center on the south side, warmth radiated from every corner, not just from the heating vents, but from the creative energy of 40 children hunched over sketch pads, their faces illuminated by the focused intensity that comes when you're discovering something true about yourself. This was the flagship location of the Harvey Ehlert Foundation for Youth Art, and it hummed with purpose. "Remember," Tiffany said, moving between workstations with the easy confidence of someone who'd found his calling, "you're not drawing what you think should be there. You're drawing what is there. Don't worry about making it pretty. Worry about making it honest." At 14, Tiffany had grown into himself in ways that went beyond the 3 inches he'd added to his height. His voice had begun to deepen. His hands, always stained with graphite, moved with practiced certainty. But it was his manner, patient, encouraging, utterly without judgment, that most resembled Claire Harvey's teaching style. A girl of about 10, her hair pulled into tight braids, raised her hand. "Tiffany, I messed up the nose. Can I start over?" Tiffany knelt beside her, studying the portrait she'd been drawing of her friend across the table. "Where's the mistake?" "It's too big. It looks wrong. Look at your model again. Really, look." Tiffany waited while the girl studied her friend's face. "Is the nose actually too big, or is it different from what you expected?" The girl looked back and forth, drawing to model, model to drawing. Slowly, understanding dawned. It's actually right. I just thought noses should be smaller." "Exactly," Tiffany smiled. "You drew the truth, but your assumptions told you it was wrong. Trust what you see, not what you think you should see." The girl returned to her work with renewed confidence, and Tiffany continued his rounds. This was what he did now. 3 days a week, after his own classes at Chicago Academy of Art, where he'd finally accepted enrollment on his own terms. He taught at foundation workshops across the city, passing on Claire's philosophy to children who'd been told they didn't matter, children who needed someone to see their potential. The foundation had exploded beyond anyone's expectations. What started as Jack's attempt to honor Claire's legacy had become a movement. 8 locations across Chicago, with plans for expansion to other cities. Free supplies, professional instruction, exhibitions that showcased student work in legitimate galleries. They'd served over 800 young artists in 9 months, many from shelters and group homes like the ones Tiffany had known. And the name Harvey Ehlert Foundation signaled something revolutionary. That billionaire philanthropy and lived experience had equal weight. That charity required humility, not just money. Jack arrived at 4:00 p.m., his now familiar presence causing barely a ripple among the students. He'd become a regular fixture at the workshops, usually working quietly in the corner on his own pieces. The children knew him not as the famous billionaire, but as Mr. H, the older guy who drew badly, but tried hard and never treated them like they were less than. Today was different, though. Today was the winter showcase, where students would display their best work for families, donors, and the broader art community. "How are we feeling?" Jack asked Tiffany quietly, helping arrange easels in the exhibition space. "Nervous," Tiffany admitted. "But good nervous. They've worked so hard." The exhibition hall was the center's pride. A soaring space with skylights that filled the room with natural light, intentionally designed to echo Claire's private gallery. Student works lined the walls, portraits, landscapes, abstracts, experimental pieces that broke every rule because their creators didn't know rules existed yet. But in the place of honor, dead center, where everyone would see it first, hung something new. Tiffany's latest piece, Perspective. It was massive, 4 feet by 6 feet, rendered entirely in graphite and charcoal. The image showed 2 figures seated facing each other, each drawing the other. On the left, a young person, clearly Tiffany, sketched an older man with focused attention. On the right, the older man, unmistakably Jack, drew the young person with equal care. But the genius was in the details. The drawing each figure created was visible on their easels, and in those drawings, within the drawing, the cycle repeated. The young person drawing the old man, drawing the young person. Infinite recursion suggesting that true seeing is reciprocal, endless, transformative. Between them, barely visible in the negative space, Claire's face emerged from the shadows, watching, guiding, present in the connection she'd made possible. Jack stood before it for a long moment, his eyes tracing every line. He'd watched Tiffany work on this piece for 2 months, but seeing it complete, properly displayed, hit differently. "It's called Perspective," Tiffany said quietly, joining him, "because that's what we gave each other. You taught me to stand tall. I taught you to look down. Together, we learned to see clearly." Jack's throat tightened. "She'd be proud of you. Of both of us." "I think she knew this would happen," Tiffany said. "I think she planned it, in her way. The note she left me about drawing someone who hides behind mirrors, that was you. She was sending me to you, even after she was gone. Tactical from beyond the grave. That was very like her." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd traveled from cruelty to compassion through the simple act of seeing each other truly. The guests began arriving at 5:00 p.m., families bundled against the cold, donors curious about where their money was going, journalists covering this unlikely success story. The children's nervous energy filled the space as they stood beside their work, ready to explain their process, their choices, their truth. At 5:30 p.m., Jack stepped onto a small platform to open the showcase. But before he could speak, Tiffany raised his hand. "Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to say something first." Jack nodded. Stepping aside, Tiffany faced the crowd, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "6 months ago, I stood in a museum and drew a portrait that changed my life. People called it brave, called it powerful, called me talented. But the truth is, I was just doing what my teacher taught me, drawing what I saw, not what people wanted me to see." He gestured to the students around him. "These kids are doing the same thing. They're not trying to make pretty pictures. They're showing you truth, their truth. The world as they see it, not as they're told it should be. And that's harder than any technical skill, braver than any grand gesture." Tiffany's eyes found Jack in the crowd. "Someone once told me that worth has nothing to do with wealth, that seeing clearly is an act of love, that the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending." He paused. "I didn't understand that at first, but working with these kids, watching them discover their voices, I finally get it. Art isn't about talent or training or expensive supplies. It's about having the courage to see yourself and others honestly, and then having the generosity to share that vision with the world." Applause began, but Tiffany raised his hand. "One more thing. The piece behind me is called Perspective, and it shows two people drawing each other. I created it to honor someone who couldn't be here tonight, Claire Harvey, who taught me everything that matters, but also to honor someone who is here, Mr. Harvey, who learned to see again, even when it hurt." Jack's eyes glistened as Tiffany continued. "Mr. Harvey, people say I gave you back your reputation, your humanity, your soul, but that's not true." Tiffany's voice softened. "You already had those things. You'd just forgotten how to see them. All I did was hold up a mirror. You're the one who found the courage to look." The crowd turned to Jack, who stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. Slowly, trembling, he approached the platform. Tiffany stepped down, and they met in the middle. "You didn't just give me back my name, Eilert," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion, using the formal address that had become their private term of affection. "You gave me back my soul." Tiffany smiled faintly, that knowing expression that was pure Claire Harvey. "No, sir, you already had it. You just forgot how to see it." Jack pulled him into an embrace, not the awkward, uncertain contact of 6 months ago, but the genuine warmth of two people who'd walked through fire together and emerged transformed. The applause that erupted then wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, genuine recognition of something rare. Proof that people can change, that cruelty can become compassion, that one moment of truth-telling can ripple outward and transform everything it touches. As the crowd circulated through the exhibition, as students explained their work with growing confidence, as families embraced children they'd almost given up on, Jack and Tiffany stood together before Perspective. "What's next?" Jack asked. "More teaching? More exhibitions?" Tiffany shrugged. "More truth. That's what Mrs. Harvey would say. Just keep drawing the truth, wherever it leads. Even when it's uncomfortable?" "Especially then." Jack laughed, a real laugh, not the performative sound he'd once used at galas. "She trained you too well." "She trained us both," Tiffany corrected. "You just had a longer journey to get there." The camera, yes, there were cameras, but invited ones this time, documenting this success story, panned slowly across the exhibition space. Children clustered around their work, explaining technique and inspiration. Families studied pieces with genuine interest, seeing their children's potential reflected in graphite and color. Donors nodded approvingly, recognizing that their money was building something real. And at the center of it all, under the massive skylight that flooded the space with winter light, children continued to sketch. The sound of graphite on paper filled the air, soft, persistent, hopeful. The sound of truth being discovered and recorded. The sound of potential being realized. The sound of Claire Harvey's legacy, alive and growing in the hands of every child she'd taught to see clearly. Jack moved to a corner easel, picking up a pencil. Still clumsy, still learning, but no longer afraid to try. Tiffany joined a cluster of students, offering quiet encouragement. And somewhere in the space between seeing and being seen, between cruelty and compassion, between the man who'd hidden and the boy who'd revealed, healing continued its quiet work. One portrait had started this journey, one moment of truth captured in graphite and courage. But the real masterpiece was what came after. Proof that when we finally stop hiding behind mirrors and masks and carefully constructed images, when we allow ourselves to be truly seen, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The sound of graphite on paper continued, soft and steady as heartbeats. Children drawing their truth, artists teaching vision. And in the center of it all, a portrait titled Perspective, reminding everyone who passed that the greatest gift we can give each other is the courage to see clearly, and the grace to let ourselves be seen. Claire Harvey had understood that truth all along. Now, through the foundation bearing two names, one wealthy and one poor, one privileged and one forgotten, united in purpose, her philosophy would reach thousands of children who needed to hear it. You matter. Your truth matters. Your vision of the world deserves to be drawn, shared, celebrated. Draw what you see, not what you're told should be there. And never, ever stop looking closely enough to capture the soul beneath the surface. The exhibition would run for 3 weeks, would be covered by major media, would spark conversations about art, class, and redemption across the country. But on this December evening, as the first showcase drew to a close and families bundled children back into winter coats, as Jack and Tiffany cleaned brushes side by side, as the last of the daylight faded behind Chicago's skyline, the moment was simpler than all that. Two people who'd started as enemies had become allies. A portrait drawn in cruelty had become a bridge to compassion. And somewhere, perhaps, Claire Harvey smiled, her final masterpiece complete, her legacy secure in the hands of the people she'd loved enough to teach truth. The lights dimmed. The exhibition closed. But the work, the real work of seeing and being seen, of drawing truth and teaching vision, that work would continue, one portrait at a time. One honest line at a time, one brave truth at a time, until the sound of graphite on paper became the sound of healing itself.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.